This is an AQA Psychology A-level revision video for Paper 1, Psychopathology, with a specific focus on phobias. So let's begin at looking where phobias appear on the specification and how they fit into the bigger picture. So there are a number of different things you have to know for phobias. You have to know the behavioural, emotional and cognitive characteristics, and then you have to know only the behavioural approach to explaining and treating phobias, which is the two-process model, including reference to classical and operant conditioning. And then the behavioural treatments are systematic desensitisation, including relaxation and use of hierarchy, and then flooding as a treatment too. So we begin by considering the behavioural, emotional and cognitive characteristics of phobias. So there are some questions on the screen, and this is your opportunity to pause the video to have a think about what at least 3 characteristics for each of the 3 categories are, and in 5 seconds I'll go through the answers. The behavioural characteristics of phobias are panic, avoidance and freezing or endurance. So those are the 3 characteristics, those are the terminology you would be expected to use in an exam. But in order to elaborate and explain what is meant by panic, avoidance or endurance, you can see the information in the brackets to help you further elaborate. The emotional characteristics of phobias are anxiety, fear and an unreasonable emotional response. Again, those are the 3 key terminology for the emotional characteristics of phobias, and you can elaborate by using that information in brackets. And then finally, your cognitive characteristics are selective attention, irrational beliefs and cognitive distortions. Those in your green are your 3 technical terms, your specialist terminology to use to identify the characteristics, but to describe or outline the characteristics, you are to use the information in brackets. Moving on to the behavioural approach to explaining phobias. Now, this is called the two-process model on the specification, and that is for the reason that it is made up of 2 processes. Just like the behaviourist approach in approaches, your knowledge of learning theory and attachments, and various other parts on the specification, you are expected to know the 2 processes, which are classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So, the behavioural approach emphasises the role of learning in the acquisition of behaviour. Learning through association is what encourages the person to acquire the phobia, which we'll go through in a moment. And the 2-process model states that, as I've just stated, phobias are learnt through classical conditioning, but they continue or they are maintained through the 2nd process of operant conditioning. So in a moment, I will go through how classical conditioning causes phobias to be learned or to be acquired using the example of Little Albert. And Little Albert is a key study that you can use in a question about the behaviourist explanation of phobias. So this is an opportunity for you to pause the video and try to explain, either using a flowchart or through words, the Little Albert case study. In 5 seconds, I will go through it. So here we have the unconditioned stimulus, which was the loud noise, the bang or the hammer being struck in the Little Albert case, which causes an unconditioned response of fear. Naturally, a loud noise or a bang, anything like that, might cause an individual to jump, and babies like Little Albert to cry and therefore have fear. Okay, that is unconditioned because we do not have to learn that response to that stimulus. So it's the unconditioned stimulus causing that unconditioned response. When you pair the unconditioned stimulus with a neutral stimulus, which is the thing that eventually becomes the conditioned stimulus, in this case the rat, pair the rat with the loud noise on numerous occasions, and that will produce at the moment an unconditioned response of fear. Eventually, through numerous pairings, the conditioned stimulus becomes the rat, causing the conditioned response. So conditioned meaning learnt. the learnt response becomes fear. And so that is your first process of the two-process model. Now, Maurer, who created the two-process model, acknowledges that classical conditioning is not enough on its own to explain why phobias are so long-lasting, why a person often lives with a phobia for the whole of their life. What Maurer does with the two-process model is uses operant conditioning to explain, as the second process, how phobias are maintained. So this is an opportunity for you to pause the video and think about the role of operant conditioning in maintenance of phobias. In 5 seconds, I'll go through the answer. So operant conditioning is learning through consequences, and that is when your behaviour is reinforced or punished. So consequences can be reinforcing, they can increase the likelihood of a behaviour occurring, increasing the frequency of a behaviour, or punishment, which decreases the frequency of a behaviour. Now I'm just going to put a little yellow box around reinforced, because it is only reinforcement that we care about for phobias, and particularly only negative reinforcement. So whilst you might have knowledge into punishment and positive reinforcement, that is useful, but not for this two-process model. So the role of negative reinforcement in phobias is this idea. Negative reinforcement, by definition, is avoiding something unpleasant, which will increase the likelihood of a behaviour. So individuals avoid situations that are unpleasant, so situations with their phobic stimulus, a spider or a rat or a snake, avoiding those situations, or even something as quite complex as the sea. By avoiding a situation, being on a beach or being near the sea, results in a desirable consequence, because you are removing that fear and that anxiety and having to deal with that negative consequence. So whenever we avoid a phobic stimulus, we get to escape the fear and anxiety that we would have experienced if we remained in the presence of that stimulus or if we went near it. And this reduction in fear or anxiety then reinforces us to avoid that behaviour again and again. So we maintain the phobia. We never confront it. We never realise that our response to this phobic stimulus is over the top and it poses no threat to us, because we maintain it through being negatively reinforced by avoiding having to confront the phobic stimulus. So that is the AO1 for the behavioural approach to explaining phobias. The next slide will be some questions around evaluation of the behaviourist explanation. So this is an opportunity to pause the video and to consider some strengths and weaknesses of the explanation before I go through the answers in 5 seconds. So the main strength of the behaviourist explanation of phobias is the practical application, based on this assumption that if phobias are learnt, then they can be unlearnt. And they can be unlearnt through the treatments that we're about to examine shortly in this video: systematic desensitisation and flooding. They are both effective treatments that have been found to reduce phobic symptoms and successfully treat individuals with phobias. So therefore, the two-process model offers useful practical applications in the treatment of phobias. And that is ultimately all we want a theory to be in psychology. We want the theory to be sound and to have useful practical applications to help improve people's lives. However, criticisms include alternative explanations. Observing others, such as a parent who has a fear of spiders, for example, might cause an individual to imitate this behaviour, which results in the phobia or the fear being developed. So there are alternative explanations apart from classical and operant conditioning, or the two-process model. And there is evidence to support this argument by Bandura and Rosenthal, who used a model to act in pain every time a buzzer sounded. And participants who witnessed and observed this then developed similar fear response. So this is evidence to show not only that we learn phobias or fears through the observation of others, but also that there are alternative explanations for phobias. And then finally, research has found not everyone who's bitten by a dog develops a phobia of dogs. And again, a better explanation could be the diathesis stress model, which proposes that we inherit a genetic vulnerability to developing particular mental disorders. And these mental disorders will only manifest, they will only occur, if you like, if it's triggered by the environment, by a life event, such as being bitten by a dog. So it might be in individuals who had been bitten by the dog did not develop the phobia because they didn't have that genetic vulnerability. And therefore, this demonstrates that the behaviourist explanation is incomplete on its own. It is a limited explanation. So we move on to examine this limit to the behaviourist explanation in a bit more detail now, in which there is an alternative explanation known as preparedness, which is this idea that evolutionary wise humans have evolved to be afraid. You can link your knowledge of the fight or flight response there, in that parts of our brain, the amygdala and the hypothalamus, are literally programmed to detect threats. So we are genetically and biologically wired to associate life-threatening stimuli with fear, and this is adaptive. We have to avoid certain things that help us to stay alive and survive and reproduce. So ancient fears are things like snakes, heights, strangers. They are all adaptive fears. They are all a result of preparedness, which can explain why people are much less likely to develop a phobia of modern objects such as cars or toasters, because they were not a danger to our evolutionary past. So that is a really effective evaluation point to use, and you can, as I say, use your knowledge from the fight or flight response and from evolution and that sort of thing, from the biological approach, to really further that argument. Moving on now to the behaviourist treatment of phobias. The behaviourist treatment of phobias that you are expected to know and evaluate are systematic desensitisation and flooding. So we're going to get started with the first treatment, which is systematic desensitisation, and this is based on the idea that if a phobia is learned, it can be unlearned. Or if you want to use the technical terminology, which I would recommend you do, if a behaviour is conditioned, it can be counter-conditioned. Counter-conditioning works through replacing fear with a harmless response. So let's examine now the specifics, what the exam board would like you to know about systematic desensitisation. So the aim of it is to gradually, and that's important, gradually reduce the phobia through classical conditioning, and to replace this feeling of anxiety with relaxation instead. The process of learning this new response is known as counter-conditioning. So this is an important key term to use when explaining systematic desensitisation. Now you have to know about the role of relaxation, and you have to understand that that is the first stage in systematic desensitisation. The role of the therapist here is to teach the patient different relaxation techniques such as deep breathing or mental imagery, the whole count to 10, imagine you're on a beach somewhere, or imagine your happy place. That sort of thing is encouraged for the patient to learn to relax, and that is because of this concept called reciprocal inhibition, which means that opposites can't occur at the same time. You can't be relaxed at the same time as being anxious. So that's what the relaxation stage is about, getting them to relax so that when they're confronted with the phobic stimulus, they cannot be anxious. So the patient and the therapist work together to construct an anxiety hierarchy, and that is on the specification, so you need to know what an anxiety hierarchy is, which is just a list of situations related to the phobic stimulus that would provoke anxiety in that patient, and they're arranged in order of least to most frightening for that person. So someone with arachnophobia, a phobia of spiders, their least sort of anxiety provoking situation might be seeing a picture of a spider, but then their most might be holding a tarantula. So that's constructed alongside the therapist. And then finally, gradual exposure, which is crucial when you're explaining systematic desensitisation. It's gradual. So they're exposed to this phobic stimulus whilst in that relaxed state that they've practiced in the first stage of the therapy. They will start at the bottom of the anxiety hierarchy and slowly move up over many sessions. The treatment has been successful once the individual can be fully relaxed in the presence of that stimulus. So in this situation, they can be fully relaxed whilst holding a tarantula. So it's a gradual process where relaxation is taught and hierarchies are produced and exposure is gradual. Moving on to the second treatment, which is flooding, again based on the idea that if a phobia is conditioned, then it can be counter-conditioned. However, flooding differs from systematic desensitization because the person is an escapable exposure. They are not able to escape the feared stimuli until the anxiety subsides, until it disappears. So flooding, it's, that metaphor of a flood, it overwhelms a person. You throw it all at them at once. You put them in a room full of spiders, you put a spider directly on their hand. So they're exposed to that phobic stimulus for a certain period of time. This isn't forever. It's not to cause any trauma to the patient. But the whole point is that eventually they will realise that the stimulus is not harmful. It poses no real threat or danger to them. And so they'll be treated for their phobia. They'll realise that those spiders cannot kill them. They cannot harm them in any way. And this works on the premise that the fear response cannot be sustained and it will eventually fall. So if you are exposed to that phobic stimulus for that certain period of time, which is sort of decided by the therapist, eventually that anxiety that you feel will subside and you will learn. Again, learn is important in behaviourist treatments, but you will learn that it poses no threat, or you will unlearn the fear that you once learned through the two-process model. So the main difference between systematic desensitization and flooding is the fact that systematic desensitization is gradual, whereas flooding is quicker and more immediate. Systematic desensitization does take commitment and it takes a long time to be successful. So that should help you out with the final part of the video where you are going to evaluate the behavioural approach to treating phobias. So this is an opportunity now to pause the video, consider the answers to these 3 questions, and I will go through them in 5 seconds. So we begin with the strength in that behaviourist treatments are faster, cheaper and require less effort than other therapies. Cognitive behavioural therapy, for example, requires a willingness for people to think about their issues, which behavioural therapies do not, because of course CBT has the cognitive element to it where you have to think, whereas behaviourist treatments, it's just about action. This means that behaviourist treatments are useful for people who lack insight into their own motivations or emotions, such as children or those with learning difficulties. So a very useful treatment or set of treatments, but useful in other ways in that people don't have to think. They don't require a willingness for people to think. You've got evidence from McGrath et al. In 1990 who found that 75% of patients with phobias responded to systematic desensitization. That is a very high percentage. That is a very successful treatment, therefore. And the key to success appears to lie with actual contact of the feared stimulus, which is called in vivo techniques, which are more successful than in vitro, which, modern day you can do the whole sort of virtual reality, put on some goggles and you see a rat if you've got a phobia of a rat, or you see spiders and you see them physically crawling up your skin, but that it's not actually happening. In vivo techniques are actually more effective, but nonetheless, systematic desensitization is an effective treatment and there is value for different techniques, so it's quite versatile. However, phobias that have an underlying evolutionary survival component, such as that what we just discussed when we evaluated the theory, they cannot be applied to systematic desensitization, so it's only partly effective at tackling particular phobias, spiders, rats, etc., but not necessarily for things with the dark or heights, things that can't be broken down into a hierarchy. And lastly, there are lots of individual differences that limit the effectiveness of flooding as a treatment. Flooding is not suitable for every patient and it's not suitable for every therapist to deliver. It's a highly traumatic procedure. It's considered ethical, so let's not make that mistake. It's ethical because the patient is giving their informed consent and they have sought help from the professional. But it's highly traumatic, and although they're aware of it beforehand, they might still quit during the treatment, so that would limit its effectiveness. Got one final evaluation point for you to consider, and that is the relevance of Freud and the iceberg analogy. So see if you can bring in your knowledge of the psychodynamic approach to consider how we can criticize the behaviourist treatment of phobias. In 5 seconds, I'll go through the answers. So this evaluation is not necessary completely, but you might find it's one that's easier to remember because it's based on your prior knowledge. So you've got symptom substitution, which is this argument that behaviourist treatments might not work with phobias, certain phobias, because the symptoms are only the tip of the iceberg. So if the symptoms are removed, the cause remains there. The symptoms will resurface in another form, which is called substitution, because some phobias, sadly, are a result of emotional or psychological trauma. So you might be addressing the symptoms of social anxiety, going out in public speaking, that sort of thing, but you are not actually addressing the cause, in that these individuals might have experienced really deep-rooted trauma. And to bring in your knowledge of the psychodynamic approach, you can use Little Hans, the case study, which was how his phobia of horses developed due to projection or displacement, we might have called it in the approaches topic, that defence mechanism. And this was due to resentment of his father, due to the Oedipus complex in the phallic stage, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with because it's a theory that tends to stick in students' minds. So it shows us the importance of treating the underlying causes of the phobia and not just the symptoms, which is what behaviourist treatments do. So that is the final evaluation for behaviourist treatment of phobias. Moving on now to recapping what you need to know for phobias. So you are expected to know the characteristics of phobias. You are expected to know the explanation of phobias according to behaviorism, which is your two-process model. And then you are expected to know systematic desensitization and flooding as treatments. Please remember, and skip back to the beginning of the video if you need to, that there are specific elements of systematic desensitization that you do need to know and be able to describe. So that concludes this video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found it useful.